Welcome to Editor's Choice, Latin American Perspectives Book Conversations. My name is Alexander Scott. I am a contributing editor and the outreach coordinator for Latin American Perspectives.
My name is Tomás Crowder Taraborelli, and I'm a member of the editorial collective and co-editor of the media and film section. We're very happy on our first podcast to have two amazing guests. Linda Farthing is a writer based in southern Mexico. She is the co-author of 4 books about Bolivia, including Coup, a story of violence and resistance with Thomas Becker, and Evo's Bolivia, Continuity and Change with Benjamin Cole. She has also written for The Guardian, Ms. Magazine, Jacobin, Al Jazeera, and The Nation.
Thomas Becker is an activist, attorney, and academic who has worked on human rights issues in Bolivia for over 15 years. He spent much of 2019 and 2020 in Bolivia investigating abuses for Harvard Law School. While many of us have some understanding of what has taken place in Bolivia, we are fortunate today to have 2 experts who can offer a more nuanced understanding of the socio-political events around the coup. Morales was accused of running a fraudulent election in 2019. Protesters took to the streets, some screaming racist slogans.
Denuncio ante el mundo y pueblo boliviano que un oficial de la policía anunció públicamente que tiene instrucción de ejecutar una orden de aprehensión ilegal en contra de mi persona. Asimismo, grupos violentos asaltaron mi domicilio. Los golpistas destruyen el Estado de Derecho.
There were clashes with police and among protesters. 35 people died.
Durante la noche del viernes, los actos de represión por parte de las fuerzas de seguridad del Estado llegaron a nuevos niveles.
Han fallecido 4 en el hospital Vierna y son 5 que han fallecido en Sacaba.
Morales resigned allegedly to avoid a massacre. Janine Áñez, a member of the Senate, whose party had received 4% of the votes in the election, claimed the presidency. Evo Morales went into exile in Argentina.
I am absolutely convinced that these violent groups are bringing racism back. And racism turns into fascism. They burned union buildings, the houses of my comrades. They attacked the house of my sister. They looted my own house.
In 2020, Luis Arce, Evo's candidate, won the election, and Áñez was sentenced to prison for mounting the coup. Now that you have some brief insight and background information on the coup, let's get to the interview. So just to start, I want to ask the first question to Thomas, which is, in your book, you write that this story is one of resistance. Can you tell us more about that?
Sure. I'm actually glad you're starting with that because I think we always talk about the negative things. And I think this is a special story in which democracy was recovered in a relatively quick amount of time through nonviolent means, which isn't always the case in Latin America. As you mentioned, you mentioned the deaths, but I should emphasize that, it wasn't just that a coup happened. A coup government was installed or took power and then just committed really unprecedented abuses in the country's history. November, the month that Áñez took power, was the second deadliest month in Bolivia's democratic history, roughly 40 years. And over the next year, she, committed these just egregious abuses, arrested people in record levels, put people on seditious lists, including myself. The minister of communications threatened to, said they had a list of seditious journalists. My guess is that Linda was on that list as well. And so they really went after people. I mean, it was a very repressive time and a really bleak time in the sense that, in all my experience in Bolivia for now, it's been actually about 2 decades and Linda's even longer. I mean, I just haven't seen such disillusionment. But, despite this really repressive atmosphere, people rose up. It wasn't really the MAS party the MAS party came back to power, but it wasn't, I think, the MAS that brought a returned democracy to Bolivia. It was the social movements. In fact, the MAS in some ways was an impediment. Áñez, she justified internationally her role as interim president, saying she was an interim president. So in Bolivia, you're supposed to call elections within 90 days as an interim president. She obviously didn't do this. She kept pushing them back. And eventually the social movements in Bolivia said, ya basta, enough of this, and quite literally rose up. They went to the streets, and this is during the pandemic when people were dying. Bolivia was hit very hard, but people said, look, we can't live under these repressive conditions. And they rose up and they protested in all the major cities. They shut down highways. And a lot of the MAS leadership said, hold on, maybe we shouldn't do this. And actually the social movement said, this isn't your decision. We're making the decisions, which I think is really lovely. I mean, Bolivia, I've been fortunate to work all over the world, and I've just never seen social movements mobilized like they do in Bolivia. It's very much, the day I arrived in Bolivia, I was actually told by a person that there's this kind of understood contract between the government and social movements. When the government gets out of line, the social movements go out and protest, and the government adjusts. And so the social movements really call the shots in many ways in Bolivia. And they rose up and they forced elections. And then in these elections, the MAS candidate, Luis Arce, won with 55%, doubling the second place candidate. I mean, it was just a complete landslide. And I think it really kind of showed, one, that you can resist in nonviolent ways, which I think is pretty lovely to see because it's not always the case. And two, as much as Lucho Arce is this dynamic candidate who's done great things, it really was a vote against repression, against racism, against all these horrible things that Áñez and her government represented. So I don't know if it was necessarily the MAS that won, but anti-authoritarianism that won, or at least in such large numbers.
Linda, could you explain to us what are some of the cultural and historical precedents to the coup? For example, the presence of white supremacy, authoritarianism, U.S. imperialism, and or neoliberalism. When Luis Camacho marched into the presidential palace in November 2019 holding a Bible, he famously said, "Never again will Pachamama, Mother Earth, return here."
So Bolivia has a very long history of racism. When I first went there in the 1980s, we called it very frequently, or we thought of it as an apartheid state without the past laws. It's a majority indigenous population or mestizo population, and with a small white minority for the most part as the ruling class, as is seen so much all over the world. So it has a very deep history of racism. It also has one of the highest rates of coups d'etats in the world, and certainly even in Latin America, which is certainly famous for the number of coups that it's had. And it suffered enormously during the neoliberal period. It was really considered sort of a poster child for neoliberalism, because when neoliberal policies were instituted initially, it was one of the highest rates of inflation in the world that the world has ever seen, and it brought it under control very quickly. But it also instituted all of the concurrent neoliberal policies that, of course, even further concentrated wealth at the top and provided very little for people at the bottom. So Bolivia is really a land of extremes. You really see these extreme playing out of these currents throughout Latin America and the world, but in a really extreme form.
Thank you, Linda, for providing that background information on neoliberalism. That's actually a perfect setup for my next question. So, Thomas, could you describe for our listeners the rise of the Movimiento al Socialismo, or MAS party? And what do you think were some of the successes of Evo Morales' MAS government?
So the MAS, I'm trying to think when to start with how the rise began, but the MAS came to power in 2006. And I think it was a manifestation of, again, not to romanticize the social movements, but the social movements in Bolivia. There'd been a series of, neoliberal policies that Bolivia resisted. So in 99 and 2000, there was the water war in Cochabamba, where people rose up after they privatized water, quite literally privatized rainwater and well water. People in Cochabamba rose up and kicked out Becker, a US-based corporation. And it was seen as this really beautiful success of resistance. In 2003, they kicked out Gonzalo Sanchez de Lozada, Goni. He's known as El Gringo in Bolivia. And he had privatized many of the industries in the 90s, and then had a plan to export gas, privatized gas, through Chile up to the global north, to Mexico, to the United States, and other places. So people rose up, protested him, and forced him to step down. In 2005, they forced his vice president to step down, who continued many of the same neoliberal policies. So there was these series of, nonviolent uprisings against this just really problematic history of I would say just colonialism's legacy. So neoliberalism, exploitation of resources in the country. And people voted in the MAS party, Evo Morales being the first president to identify as indigenous in the country. And it was a real shock to the ruling class. Linda had mentioned Bolivia's almost exclusively been run by people that look more like me than the indigenous majority. And so this was a real shock to the system. And instantly the MAS kind of started changing things. And so I'll go through a few of the successes, but I think his cabinet is a perfect example. I mean, 14 of 16 of his cabinet members were indigenous. And this was a shock to a country that always had white people ruling. They introduced gender parity, which never, obviously, it didn't reach its goal, but it still was kind of a revolutionary concept. Nationalized industries instantly or almost instantly. I think nationalization is not the exact correct term, but they took just over 50%, a controlling share of the industries, and started using those resources to really go back to the community. So a lot of this went into education, into healthcare. Healthcare, 20% of rural folks didn't have healthcare and drinking water. By the end of 2020, it was something like 36%. Poverty, they did an excellent job of reducing poverty in the country. They basically halved both poverty and extreme poverty, or more than halved it, which is pretty radical. Bolivia had the fastest growing economy in South America up until the coup. So the government had actually done a good job. I mean, there were certainly missteps, and we can talk about failures as well, but they did a good job, and really that affected most Bolivians. So it wasn't just the poor and the ultra poor that did better. The middle class did better. Even the upper class did better. Again, it was the fastest growing economy. So, a lot of the animosity, I think, about Evo Morales had less to do with, in some ways, his policies, because in some ways everybody was better off. But the racism that exists in Bolivia, that white people don't like an indigenous person, telling them what to do or running a country. I think that was a big piece of it.
If I could just add a couple of things here, going back to the 90s, when Tom was very young, in the mid 90s is when the MAS got its start. And it really started out of the coca growers movement and the coca growers resisting the US war on drugs. Evo Morales was a coca grower leader of the 5 federations in the Chapare, which is east of Cochabamba. And at some point in coca grower conferences, they decided to enter the political system, the democratic political system. A large reason for that was because, and it was a neoliberal policy and it was part of decentralization, was to create municipalities throughout the country. So for the first time in Bolivia's history, rural areas were actually getting funds to do something. And in the Chapare, the municipalities were controlled by the unions, by the coca grower unions. And that experience in a couple of years convinced the coca growers that there was a space that they could exploit, or they could expand and expand the demands for working class and rural indigenous people through the quote unquote democratic system, or the existing political system. So that was when they formed the beginnings of the MAS. And the MAS was notable because it's one of the very few parties in Latin America that began in a rural area. Almost all political parties are urban, right? Everywhere. And it slowly and gradually expanded to include more and more, particularly rural people, and the rural unions, because Bolivia is a highly organized society. I mean, everybody, people talk about partido de taxi. Like if you had 3 or 4 people in a taxi, you've got a political party, and every possible group that you could imagine is organized. I mean, a book has just come out about, informal workers and the level of organization within informal workers. And we never think of informal sector workers as being organized. So at around 2002, it started to move into urban areas, and it started to more appear like a political party. a traditional political party. Because before that, it insisted, and it still insists to a great extent, that it's a political movement, not a political party, because political parties, like in many parts of the world, are very highly discredited among the population. In terms of just adding something to what Tom said about the successes of the MAS, very much responding to that base, they made investments in rural areas, larger investments in rural areas, and particularly in infrastructure and roads, schools, health centers, and the like, throughout the country in rural areas like has never been seen before. And I've been in rural areas from one part of Bolivia to another, and in almost everywhere you go, there's a new school or there's a health post or whatever, or a new road or an improved road. So there was a real investment for the first time in rural areas. And even though the country, like everywhere in the world, is becoming more urban very rapidly, there are still large numbers of people who live in rural areas, and a lot of indigenous peoples, in order to maintain indigenous culture, you start to lose it. It's like any immigrant, right? I mean, you move to any city anywhere, people start to lose their culture of origin. And that's certainly happening with indigenous people. I mean, it's being transformed into an urban indigeneity, but a lot of the very traditional indigenous values are definitely being reduced. So that investment in rural areas has made a huge, really a huge difference. But there's also been investment in the urban areas, and all of this was financed basically by the commodity boom. I mean, all of the pink tide governments in Latin America between roughly 2005 and 2014 benefited from the fact that there was a huge commodity boom. And whereas traditionally that money would have gone to the multinationals, one of the things that the Morales government managed to do was to cut the best deal Bolivia has ever had with multinationals or foreign investors and get a bigger share of the profits, which they then invested in all of these social programs.
Excellent, thank you. A follow-up question. You spent some time in your book discussing Morales' position in regards to extractivist policies. Can you tell us a little bit more about that, since it seems to be at the center of many economic disputes in Latin America, how to develop, how to pay loans, etc. Argentina is going through that, Brazil is going through that, Bolivia went through that too. So can you elaborate a little bit on that, Linda, on the extractivist policies of the Morales government and the controversies around it?
Well, this was at the heart of many of the middle class, I would say, intellectual protests against the Morales government, and still is. Bolivia has one of the highest rates of extractivism historically in all of Latin America. It and Mexico had the most valuable silver mines during the Spanish colony. Then Bolivia had a huge boom around tin. And most recently, natural gas. So the country has been dependent really since the Spaniards invaded South America on extractivism. And breaking away from that in the course of 15 years is almost impossible. But opponents would argue, and there's certainly some merit to this argument, that in fact the government expanded extractivism. Now with technological changes and the flood of investment from China and some from India as well, there has been an enormous expansion in extractivism in South America, really increasingly encroaching on indigenous territory and vital and important environmental reserves all through the Amazon. And this is a problem and a cause of real concern, whether the government is left-wing or far right-wing. I mean, Bolsonaro is basically doing the same thing in many ways. However, I think that one of the LAP editors, Steve Elner, makes a very important point, which is that the pink tide governments have dealt with this process very differently. Certainly, they've directed the profits to programs that have benefited the majority of the population as opposed to into the hands of a few, either national or foreign. And they also have tended to attempt to stabilize the country, and this is certainly the case in Bolivia, thanks to Luis Arce, really stabilize the country's economic situation. I mean, Bolivia is kind of astounding. I mean, it's gone from being what was always considered South America's economic basket case to be considered one of Latin America or South America's most economically stable countries. And a lot of that, I think, is thanks to the work that Arce has done, who's now president, has done and did in the Ministry of the Economy and continues to do. But extractivism is an issue, and it's an unresolved issue. Bolivia borders 5 other countries. It has very porous borders. So, for example, currently its actual biggest export income is not coming from gas, but is coming from gold, which is very, very high priced commodity, has a very high price at the current time. And Bolivia has turned into be one of the largest mercury importers in South America, and distributes that mercury to all of its neighbors. Now, well, any of us who know anything about mercury know that this is a disaster, both for people's health and for the natural environment. And a lot of the gold mining in Bolivia is illegal. I mean, it goes out as contraband. The government it's a very uncontrolled industry, I guess is the best way to describe it. So, and of course it's expanding because there's so much money to be made. There's so much money to be made, whether you're at the bottom of the pile and you're just a miner, trying to support your family, or whether you're a larger corporation. And that is the heart of the dilemma, I think, that Bolivia and countries like it face, is how to diversify the economy. And the industrialization efforts that have taken place to date, there's been some successes, but there's also been a lot of white elephants and a lot of failures and a lot of decisions made about industrialization projects that are based on expanding and strengthening a political base rather than on where you're going to sell whatever it is that you're industrializing.
You're listening to Editor's Choice, a podcast from Latin American perspectives. Today we're talking with Linda Farthing and Thomas Becker about their new book, Coup, A Story of Violence and Resistance in Bolivia. Now, we've already started to touch upon the significant indigenous character and presence in Bolivia, and we've also talked about the indigenous social movements and cocolero unions that helped produce the MAS. But Thomas, could you briefly describe the ideological character and social makeup of the Bolivian opposition who supported the coup?
So, who supported and who carried out are somewhat different. I would say, and maybe Linda, you may differ, but I would say probably the biggest indicator of whether you think it was a coup or not is your race and your class. So very much, I think the opposition is made up of white folks and generally middle and upper class, more urban folks. That doesn't mean that there hasn't been people that were part of the opposition that resisted or had criticisms of the MAS government. So there are legitimate critiques of the MAS government, but in general, those who carried out the coup and the major supporters were, I would say, white and rich, or richer, middle class and upper class. The government was very much a right-wing evangelical government. But I do want to mention, before I kind of jump into the government, there was an intellectual progressive middle class and upper class that supported the coup. And again, I think this goes to, people ended up siding with their class more than ideology. So it wasn't just evangelicals that were part of the opposition. There's a legitimate critique on the left, but there also were, I would say, just bourgeois leftists who, at the end of the day, didn't like Evo Morales for personal reasons or some of his politics, and got in bed with the right. And they played a really, I think, dangerous role in the coup, because I think they legitimized, a lot of these right-wing evangelicals, people like Arturo Murillo, who was kind of the right-hand man of Áñez, he was the Minister of Interior, I mean, this guy's an animal. He would constantly say, like, we're going to go after you and round you up like animals and butcher you, and just really kind of vile language. He had said, before the coup, he'd said about abortion that women who wanted to go get abortions should go to the top of a building and jump off and kill themselves, or something along those lines. So they were very right-wing, very crass. But then you have this kind of intellectual class of kind of progressives, moderates, who, at least to the global north, help legitimize the coup and really whitewash a lot of the abuses. But overall, the government was comprised of, I mean, you mentioned, I believe, like Áñez, her party had something like 4%. She was a fringe candidate. She was a kind of a nobody. She was only really known for tweeting out racist things about indigenous people not wearing shoes and their customs being satanic. So she was relatively unknown. But her first cabinet was basically comprised of right-wing business people and people who basically wanted to return to a republic. I mean, there's still kind of this debate in Bolivia. Evo Morales made Bolivia the plurinational state of Bolivia to incorporate all the indigenous communities in Bolivia. And there's people who still think that Bolivia should be a republic from when the Spanish came. And so much of the opposition are far right-wing evangelicals and whites. The Catholic Church was involved in the coup. I mean, I should mention, there was a meeting after Morales stepped down. There was a meeting of opposition members in which they named Áñez. And the people in this meeting were the Catholic Church, Bolsonaro's ambassador, the Brazilian ambassador, a representative of the EU who also ideologically is right-wing, and opposition members. So a bunch of opposition candidates chose Áñez. Again, nothing about this was legitimate. But one or two of these people in this meeting were not necessarily fachos, as I would say, fascist right-wing. They were centrists. But again, they decided to, back their class and their race. So anyway, the government, I think, was far right-wing. The support was urban, upper class, generally right-wing, but did have some intellectual progressives involved as well.
We're also aware that the support for the coup wasn't just based in Bolivia, but was very much an international phenomenon. So Linda, I was hoping you would address the issue of the pro-coup narrative that was prevalent in the media outlets of the global north especially, which in your book you define as the rhetoric of fraud.
Yeah, the opposition was very successful. In 2016, there was a referendum. So Evo Morales should not have run in 2019 by in terms of the Constitution of 2009. He had so that was going on, and they did a referendum in 2016 in which he lost, very barely, but he lost when he asked whether he could run again, and the vote went against him. And he said at the time, he came on the television, I saw him, he came on and said he would not run, he would step down. Well, the MAS and Bolivia, and as in much of Latin America, is built around the strong male authority as the leader. And political parties are very weak, and institutions are very weak. So the checks and balances that control people from power going to their heads is very limited. And the MAS party was not really in condition to find someone viable to replace him. And so he ran again. Now, the opposition seized on this to a certain extent legitimately. He was not respecting his referendum. And the Constitution said he couldn't run. However, they blew it up into this debate, this discussion that Evo Morales would do anything he could to stay in power, including committing fraud in the election. And so they hammered home this message of fraud without any really legitimate backing. The Mas government had done, I think, 6 or 7 elections by that point, which including like recall and referendums and so on and so forth, that the international community had said were legitimate. So there was no strong indication that, or no strong argument you could make based on past experience that this election was going to be fraudulent. The international community seized on this, seized on the fact that Evo was not respecting the Constitution, et cetera, and bought into this fraud narrative. And so when he was replaced, you had all of these sources, these media sources saying that democracy had been restored in Bolivia. Well, it's quite possible to have somebody be illegitimate and run for government, but there also to be a coup. And so those two things actually happened. In other words, both sides can behave badly. I hate to say it, but it's really true in the world. And the process that led to the removal of, or the resignation of Evo was a completely unconstitutional, illegal process. And everything about the selection of Áñez was completely illegal. They went after opposition figures. They threatened to burn people's houses down, and so people resigned. They were terrified of staying in office, even though they were next in line for the job of president, even though they would have been essentially an interim president. And Bolivia had this experience in 2005 with Eduardo Rodriguez Velce, who was at that time was the head of the Supreme Court, and he managed to put in an interim government for 6 months whose only job was to run elections. And that was essentially what any government that displaced Morales was supposed to do. And of course, the Áñez government did not do this.
Can I add something? Because I think so much of this is
because I feel like I left stuff out.
No, well, but it's also such an important piece of this, because I think that this notion of fraud has been used to justify everything that happened. And there's a couple things I want to say about that. One, it's turned into this like binary or like one, we can discuss whether or not there was fraud, which per the Washington Post, New York Times, this MIT study, there was not. But even if there was, that cannot justify the kidnapping of high-level officials, family members, and their torture. And I mean, this happened to literally everyone in the line of succession received real threats to their lives. It was not just abstract threats. People saying, we're going to kill you, kidnapping them, burning their homes. Victor Borda, who was the president of Congress, who was in the line of secession, they kidnapped his brother, tortured him, and said, if you do not resign, Victor Borda, we're going to kill your brother. So he went on television and said, I'm resigning to save the life of my brother. There's nothing democratic about that. And whether there was fraud or not cannot justify it. And I feel that this discussion around fraud, in some ways, I think it's important to have, but I also think it's often used as a tool to distract and to kind of throw a bunch of dust in the air. And these things cannot justify what happened. And I also kind of want to rewind a little more, just because I think that the right wing in Bolivia, they don't have much of a strategy. It's always kind of been throw it at the wall and see what sticks. And these were things that stuck. So you do have Evo's decision to run again, which the Constitution limits how many times he can run. A piece that Linda didn't mention was he brought a case to the Constitutional Court of Bolivia, which said that he could run. And they based this on other countries in Latin America that use this argument that it's a human right to have indefinite presidential reelection. I don't agree with that assessment. I don't agree with the court's ruling, but it is important because I think it's always been framed on the terms of the right wing that he is this dictator and he did anything to stay in power. He went through kind of proper channels. I do think Bolivia has a weak judicial system and will kind of side with whoever's in power, but it wasn't like he just said, I'm just ignoring this, I'm just going to do it. He went through proper channels. This was based on precedent in other countries, that in Central America, that the United States and other countries who were critical of Evo's decision to run again never had a problem when these other countries did the same thing. That's not to justify it, but I do think we have to contextualize this. And he ran again. I think it's something else worth mentioning is he wasn't going to run again. And from my sources in the mosque, he legitimately didn't want to. And then it came down to, we don't have a candidate. I think this was a huge mistake of the mosque to not groom other folks and not prepare other people. It very much was Evo-centric. But the reality became they didn't have another candidate. And, from what I hear is it came down to, if we lose, it's not just like you lose to another legitimate Democratic Party. You lose to an opposition that guns down people like they did when Áñez took power. So there was this real fear or this desperation of, well, shoot, what do we do? I guess Abel should run again because we can't have, the alternative is so dangerous for the majority of the country, for the indigenous majority. I'm not justifying it, but I do think that is context that's really important and makes Evo Morales very different than, some megalomaniac who's just like, I will stay in power forever and step on all people. And because I don't think that's necessarily the case. I mean, it could be a mixture of things, but there's a lot of context that makes this really important. And I think this notion of him running again stuck. This was the right wing threw it at the wall and that one stuck. And this notion of fraud before any vote was cast. I mean, we saw it in the United States. Trump planted this seed months before the election. And it's something that, a lot of us thought this is fringe, like fringe people maybe believed it, but nobody really believes it. But there's a critical mass of people that believes there was fraud in the United States. And that happened in Bolivia. And sorry to talk a little more about the fraud, but when the Organization of American States monitored elections and said that there were irregularities, that legitimized what was otherwise kind of a fringe view. All of a sudden it became very legitimate. Granted, the OAS they made egregious errors. A lot of this was based on the fact that, sorry, I'm diving into the weeds, but I think that it's important. In Bolivia, you have to win a presidency, you have to win either with a majority or with 40% and beat the second place candidate with 10%. Very long, I'm giving you the Cliff Notes version, but what had happened on the Sunday during the elections, at the end of the day, Evo Morales was winning with 38%, something like that, shy of 40, but also not beating by 10%. The following day, when the count returned, he had reached that 10% threshold. But what had happened in Bolivia is, and it happens in the United States, when it goes to California, the rural votes came in, and almost exclusively rural indigenous people vote for the MAS party, particularly in the highlands. And so if you look at the last multiple elections, the MAS has always jumped up that following day as the rural votes came in. So it was totally legitimate. It was totally explainable. But the OAS had made this statement prematurely. And then that was basically took a match to the gasoline that was all over the streets and it just exploded. And so the right wing's kind of fringe narrative that had really not had that much traction, then all of a sudden became legitimate to the international community. And then that's still kind of the discourse that pervades this discussion is that, Evo Morales committed fraud and he was an illegitimate president. And I think neither's necessarily the case, although I do think his decision to run again it was problematic. But again, these were things that the right wing took advantage of to really kind of create a smokescreen and distract from the fact that Áñez then took power in an absolutely illegal way. And sorry, I'm going to add one more thing. The same people that were critical of Evo's decision to run again or fraud that use this discourse of democracy were silent when there was this absolutely illegal transition. So, which to me signals in many ways that it really wasn't about democracy, but more about their class returning to power. Because if they really did care about democracy, no one can justify, Áñez's complete overthrow is what it was.
Can you speak to the part that American right-wing politicians like Marco Rubio, Ted Cruz, Mike Pompeo, and President Donald Trump, together with the National Endowment for Democracy, may have played in funding coup plotters?
So, instantly the U.S. government supported the coup. Trump tweeted, "We support Áñez." There were meetings before the coup in which right-wing leaders in the United States, like Rubio, Ted Cruz, had met with opposition folks in Bolivia. Sorry, I'm since I work in human rights, I'm going to kind of talk about it through a human rights lens, but because I think it's really human rights has become a very powerful tool of the right wing in the Americas. You can't get away with the coups of the 70s and 80s and 60s. Maybe you simply can't. I mean, so there was one in Burma recently, and the international community, of course, doesn't support it. So you have to frame it differently. You have to use different mechanisms. And so the right wing's caught on to this, and you can't just, drive down the streets in tanks and take over a government. So they use this discourse of democracy and human rights, and they've created a lot of these kind of faux NGOs in Bolivia that have really lovely names that sound like, Center for Democracy and stuff like that sound like they're doing good things, but really they are groups that fund right-wing anti-democratic forces. And even some of the I would say almost legitimate human rights institutions have been co-opted in Bolivia. So the Permanent Assembly of Human Rights, which was kind of the central human rights institution in the country, has become basically an organizing center for the opposition. They quite literally have opposition party members come there and organize. They organized a lot of the groups, La Resistencia La Paz, which were kind of these quasi-paramilitary groups that attacked people, organizing in their offices. And so, but they sound a lot better than the Nazi Youth Union, or even like Camacho, who was one of the big right-wing leaders who supported the coup and really played a big role in it. His youth organization in Santa Cruz, there's videos of them doing, the Hail Hitler, the Nazi salute. I mean, these are openly kind of fascist groups. That doesn't work so well. So you have to find these kind of lovelier institutions with names like, Human Rights Center and Democracy First and things like that. And I think it makes it a lot more palatable. And the US government has certainly supported groups like that. I want to add one thing too, because I think this notion that it was just the right wing in the United States that supported the coup can be problematic, because very much Democrats did. And I think in some ways, I'll chalk it up to, Bolivia's off the map. Half the Democrats probably think Bolivia is Bosnia or Botswana. So it's just not on their radar. So they get whatever information's fed to them. So some of it might be harmless. Others is not. Others, I think, very direct. And the Áñez government was really savvy, and the Bolivian right wing has been savvy. They've already got the Pompeos and the Ted Cruz and the Rubios. They don't need to lobby them. So they've actually been very effective at lobbying Democrats, moderate Democrats, and painting this different story. And they've even hired Democratic lobbyists. So there's an organization, CLS Strategies, which has worked for a bunch of Democratic candidates. One of the at least one people on the team there is a top advisor, or was a top advisor to Biden, was a top advisor to Obama. And CLS Strategies was hired to rebrand Áñez's image, or the government's image, in terms of human rights, democracy, and elections. And what they did is they set up a bunch of fake Facebook accounts, Twitter accounts. They were the first US company punished by Facebook for basically spreading fake news, creating fake accounts. But these are Democratic pollsters and Democratic strategists that the opposition is quite literally hired. And I think that's been a really successful strategy, because like I said, Rubio, you don't need to convince him. He's on board. You got to convince the center. And that's why I think you have the New York Times and these kind of more, mainstream kind of centrist news outlets. It now seems legitimate because you have Democratic candidates saying, boy, this seems really scary, this Evo Morales guy. That's been part of their strategy. So it's not just been the right. It's been Republicans and Democrats have been pretty darn bad on Bolivia. And frankly, I mean, Biden's not been great on it. Áñez was arrested for her role in the coup and charged with her role in the coup. And, the Biden administration has been outspoken. They've said this is political persecution. The U.S. envoy, State Department envoy, had recently stated that there was no coup, and that the Organization of American States expert group said that there was no coup. That's actually just either an egregious mistake or a lie. This expert group that was hired to kind of look into the abuses that took place around the coup said that this was an undemocratic transition. So they've kind of peddled the right-wing narrative, despite them maybe being, at least on the U.S. spectrum, not as as far right. Linda, I didn't know if you want to add about
a little bit. Yeah, I was just going to add a little bit about the NED. We did some research. I mean, that's obviously the NED is the money you can track. There's probably all kinds of money going on that you simply can't track. But the NED invested not huge sums in Bolivia. It's a small country, and the money goes a long way. But invested money in, as Tom said, a variety of organizations with names, some of them established, some of them more recently established, that really were channels for supporting the opposition. And we're very, very pretty explicit about being channels for supporting the opposition. And that is, by any measure, political meddling. And certainly fed into the Mas both fear and anger towards the United States. But I would say, I mean, there were also other regional players, right-wing regional players, and I would say most, although the evidence isn't totally in place, or I haven't seen it, but I would say Brazil. You know, Brazil has a lot of economic interests in Bolivia, both in gas. I mean, Bolivian gas is the primary gas for Sao Paulo. And it also has a lot of interest in soy and some interest in gold as well. So, and you have a very right-wing government in Brazil, and it really is the regional superpower. So, and increasingly so. So I think there's definitely some evidence that Bolsonaro gave the green light to this process, and to what degree they actually supported it beforehand is not clear, but I think that there is some indication they did. And then subsequently evidence came out that Argentina and Ecuador had given supplies to Áñez's government to control protests.
And Bolsonaro, I should add, he provided planes. His ambassador was there in the meeting and helped name Áñez. I mean, so I think the connections are, I think more is becoming uncovered as we speak, but there's direct links to all these right-wing countries that surround Bolivia that participated in the coup, in addition to the United States.
So that is a perfect setup for what my next question is, which is, do you both think that this coup was part of a transnational campaign like Operation Condor was in the 1970s? Recently, former Argentine President Mauricio Macri was investigated for sending ammunition to Bolivia just after the coup. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on this.
So, yeah, I think, certainly in Bolivia, they refer to it as like Operation Condor 2. I would say yes and no. I don't think it's as like institutionalized and organized. I think it was, they saw a moment of weakness and the right wing jumped in to help back the right wing in Bolivia. So certainly I think this was a transnational coup in many ways. I don't think it was quite as organized, but I do think, yes, I mean, so Argentina, Ecuador, they sent weapons. These weapons were used to repress people during the dictatorship or during this illegitimate regime. Brazil was certainly involved. And even actually, Fernandez has brought charges against Macri for his role in the coup. Recently, Bolsonaro has stated that he will give amnesty to Áñez. I'm not sure if you've seen this, Linda. I think it just happened last week. So there is, the right wing certainly is buddying up and helping each other. I don't know. I mean, who knows? This is something that, years later, we may find that they were certainly way more involved in actually planning this. I will say that I think people were kind of caught off guard in the coup, both the Mas and the opposition. It was kind of, everyone was like, wow, this is happening. Let's go with it. And they ran. So it seems a little less organized than a lot of the planned Condor coups or Operation Condor coups. But again, I think certainly there's been interference by the international community, the right-wing international community, and they've helped repress people and cover up repression in the same way that they did in the 70s.
Okay, well, we're almost reaching our time. I wanted to congratulate you for the book. I think it's really amazing. I've learned a lot about the coup that I didn't know, and other things that helped me understand better the political dynamics of something like this that I can see it happening in many other places in Latin America. But before we wrap up, do you want to add anything, or is there something we didn't ask that you would like to address or to talk about the book? I know that you say somewhere in the book, I can remember it was you, Thomas, or Linda, that you said that you will never write another book. And then either Thomas convinced Linda or Linda convinced Thomas. I'm not sure what the dynamic was, but I don't know. Anything else you want to add about either the process of writing the book or the book itself?
Well, it was actually Thomas who convinced me. I mean, he's still young enough that he's probably got several books left in him. But I think that we both, at the end of the day, we both lived through that coup. We were both in Bolivia, and I was reporting during that period of time and really trying to get out the story about what was really going on, and really disputing the narrative that was in places like the New York Times, that this was not a coup and this was a restoration of democracy, et cetera. And I think that we needed to write the book both at a personal level and a political level. One was a need to tell the story of what we really saw had happened, but also, as my daughter pointed out to me at one point, a need to process it. I mean, it was very, very difficult to live through that. And it was very distressing to lose friends. Both Thomas and I both lost, middle-class intellectual friends who really shifted very strongly to the right, much to our surprise and distress. And to feel also the threat, and feel threatened by the state, and feel threatened by fascists. I mean, I don't think there's another word for it. I mean, I never had really in my life confronted fascism like that. So I think that it was both a political need to tell the story and to really get this cautionary tale out there, because once again, Bolivia provides this really stark example of what can happen in any given situation. But also, I think it was a need to personally process it. It was a way of dealing with all of that emotional turmoil that both of us, or I certainly went through during that especially that month of November, those 6 weeks, I would say 6 to 8 weeks.
No, I mean, just to repeat kind of what you said, one, to process. I mean, still, like I've never, I brought a case against Bolivia's ex-president, and we were successful. We won. I certainly have enemies in Bolivia, and I've never had issues like I had during the coup, or even now. I mean, I get attacked in Bolivia by fascist groups. They like assault me. The really scary thing is it's not always, the equivalent of like the Proud Boys. Some of them are. Others are like soccer moms that start yelling, get out of our country, you Indian lover, and then literally like hitting me, which frightens me because it's become that normalized that it's not fringes. This is the people that you would think are normal people behaving like fascists. I mean, just overtly racist. It's really scary. I guess what I want to add is that, Linda said she'd never write another book again. Something we struggled with is we didn't know if we were the right people to tell the book. I mean, two gringos writing about Bolivia is endless. The number of like white anthropologists that love to write about Bolivia, it can be problematic. It's very colonialist. And so we had real reservations, but we were both in a really unique situation that allowed us to write the book. I think as white people, we were able to actually have a voice and escape the country. I mean, when I was put on a list of seditious people, I could come to the US. I taught at Harvard, this overrated institution, and had all the protections of that folks in Bolivia didn't have. And so she was there covering the coup. I was there also doing the same. I was at the very first massacre that happened right after Áñez took power in this town of Sacaba. And, sorry for like an anecdote, but it really impacted me. And I was in one of the hospitals with this person who had been, with a lot of people who had been shot. There was quite literally bodies everywhere. And one of the people just came out of this coma, and he'd been shot in the eye, and he started crying out of the eye. He was saving another person who had been shot. One of the things the military was doing was targeting people who were helping the injured. And this guy went to help an injured person who was shot in the eye. And he started crying out of his one eye and basically said, "You're going to see tomorrow, we're going to get blamed. Everyone's going to say it's us. Nobody's going to believe us because we're poor and we're Indian." And I almost naively thought, I've documented massacres all over the world. I've been in Bolivia. I understand the really problematic history of racism, but I thought, boy, how could that be? This is such a black and white massacre. I mean, it was really one of the clearest massacres I've ever seen. Every single person killed or injured was an indigenous protester. Zero police, zero soldiers were killed or injured. All the bullet trajectories. I mean, it was very, very clear. But the dominant narrative was they shot themselves to make the Áñez government look bad, or the Mas party was behind it. And I was devastated that such a clear thing could be so easily manipulated. And that became in many ways the discourse of the international community. And so Linda and I had this, we were there and we saw things that quite literally no one else saw. And particularly those, or except those who'd suffered from it and didn't have the same platform that she and I had. And so we in many ways felt a responsibility. And so we tried to insert as much of the voices of people on the ground as possible to make this a book about them, or use quite literally their voices rather than ours. But we, in some ways, were kind of the tool for them to amplify their voices in some ways. So we were hesitant, but this was really important to us to try to counter that narrative that this was a legitimate transition. And also to add on to that, for me, and I think Linda as well, what took place was scary beyond the fact that like all the oppression and even like the attacks on us. This really became the blueprint for how to carry out a coup. As I mentioned earlier, you can't do the Pinochet style coups where you're driving down the streets and you have a mustachioed, general with, in his camouflage. Like the international community is not going to accept that. So you have to have something very different. And this is why Áñez was such a good face of the new government. She was this light-skinned blonde woman. She can't be a dictator. And they really sold it as something different. And it's scary because though the face was different, it was equally as repressive as these coups in the 70s. And so we felt it was really important to highlight this is the 21st century coup. I was in the elections in 2020. I happened to be with some folks in Castillo's team in Peru and Lugo from Paraguay, who was overthrown in kind of a soft coup as well. And they were talking about these are the most important elections for the Americas of this century, because this is going to determine whether you can get away with it or not. So there were a lot of actually big political kind of leftists or folks who have kind of endured similar style coups in Bolivia because they were so concerned about are the golpistas going to be able to do this or not? And part of the reason, like I said, we did this book was to make sure these 21st century coups, that the world knows this is how they happen now. And you need to be on the lookout because they're going to happen again. And for instance, in Peru, they tried to say Castillo, there was fraud, same discourse, same narrative, happened in Chile, but, it was such an overwhelming win. He, wasn't able to pull it off. Bolsonaro had used similar discourse. So this has kind of become the playbook in many ways. And so we wanted to show an example of here's the playbook and here's the people who resisted it and how you can resist it, hopefully to try to stop other coups that may happen.
Well, once again, I just want to say thank you so much for coming in today and meeting with us. Your book is truly fantastic. And like Tomas said, I learned an incredible amount reading it. And I really agree with his view that this is just a wonderful resource for understanding not just contemporary issues in Bolivia. This offers incredible insight into how we can understand the modern coup and really neo-fascism in action, which is really just an invaluable contribution.
No, it's un gusto. Thank you both. This is a good time.
Yeah, thank you.
That is all the time we have for today, but thank you for listening in. Coup, A Story of Violence and Resistance in Bolivia, is available for purchase online at haymarketbooks.com. Check the show notes for links to where you can order a copy and information on how to get in touch with Linda and Thomas, or me and Tomas. If you enjoy the show and would like to receive updates about Latin American news, current events, and content from our journal, please don't forget to follow us on any or all of our social media pages on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. And be sure to listen in to our next episode. Gracias.